5 o'clock in the morning, the 7th of August, 1914. The first French soldiers of the First World War step across the German border, and they are not stepping into Belgium, not into Lorraine, not into the killing fields you have heard about 100 times. They are walking east, into Alsace, toward a single industrial city the French nation has dreamed about for 44 years. Here is the part nobody tells you. France would capture this city. France would parade through its streets to the sound of weeping crowds throwing flowers. And France would lose it again in barely 36 hours. Then France would come back, take it a second time, capture 3,000 prisoners and 24 guns and abandon it once more. The city would not fly the French flag again until the war was over, 4 years and millions of deaths later. 100 men died taking the first border town. The general who led the attack would be fired within 72 hours. The cavalry commander beside him fired too. And the whole bloody adventure was launched not for a river crossing, not for a railway junction, not for any cold strategic prize, but for pride, for a wound 44 years old, for the memory of a defeat in 1870. This is the Battle of Mulhouse, the very first French offensive of the entire war, and it tells you everything about how France believed the war would be won and why that belief was about to be buried in blood. So how did the opening shot of the Great War, fired in a quiet corner of Alsace, turn into a humiliation that cost 2 generals their careers in a single week? To understand why French boots were marching east at dawn, you have to understand a scar that had never healed. In 1870 and 1871, Prussia crushed France in a war that lasted barely 10 months. The price of defeat was carved out of French flesh. The provinces of Alsace and Lorraine were handed to the new German Empire. For 44 years, French schoolchildren grew up staring at maps where those provinces were shaded black, draped in mourning. A statue in Paris representing the lost city of Strasbourg sat veiled, year after year, like a coffin that was never buried. Generations of officers were raised on one idea above all others. Someday, France would take it back. That idea had a name, Plan 17. It was the master strategy of the French High Command, and at its heart beat a single conviction that the soul of the French soldier, the famous spirit of the attack, would carry the army eastward across the frontier and reclaim the stolen ground. Where the Germans believed in firepower and railways and grinding mass, the French believed in élan, in the bayonet, in the will to advance no matter the cost. At the top of this machine sat one man, General Joseph Joffre, the French commander-in-chief, heavy, calm, slow to anger, slower still to panic. Joffre knew that the real German blow was coming somewhere to the north, through Belgium, swinging like a great scythe. But he also understood something colder. If he could send a force into Alsace and start a fight, he could pin German troops down in the south, far away from the decisive battlefields. The Germans, it turned out, wanted exactly the same thing in reverse, to tie down French divisions there. 2 enemies, each trying to trap the other in the same corner of the map. But there was something the strategists at the top did not feel, and the politicians did. Alsace was not just a flank, it was a symbol. To plant the tricolor in an Alsatian city in the first days of the war would set every church bell in France ringing. It would tell the world that the long mourning was over. And so the very first operation France launched was aimed not at the heart of the German army, but at the heart of French sentiment, a city called Mulhouse. The man handed this sacred mission was General Louis Bonneau, commander of the French 7th Corps. And here is the first crack in the whole enterprise. Bonneau did not want to do it. He looked at the orders and he smelled a trap. His corps was to be detached from the First Army of General Auguste Dubail and thrown forward from the fortress region around Belfort, deep into Alsace, toward Mulhouse, and beyond toward Colmar, more than 30 kilometers to the northeast. Under him marched the 14th Infantry Division of General Louis Curé and the 41st Infantry Division of General Paul Superbe, with the 8th Cavalry Division of General Louis Aubier screening the flank. A fine force on paper. But Bonneau kept asking a question that haunted him. Where are the Germans? The defenses in front of him were thin, suspiciously thin. The German 7th Army, commanded by Generaloberst Josias von Heeringen, had been ordered to hold Alsace lightly and let the real war be won far to the north. In the Mulhouse sector, the Germans had left little more than a single brigade of second-line troops, militia and reservists, perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men. To Bonneau, an empty doorway meant an ambush behind it. He moved like a man walking into a dark room, one hand on the wall. And the ground itself seemed to whisper warnings. This was old killing country. The plain between Belfort and the Rhine, hemmed in by the dark wall of the Vosges Mountains to the west and the river to the east, was a corridor armies had bled in for 2,000 years. Long before any Frenchman or German existed, Roman legions and Germanic tribes had dug in and slaughtered each other on this exact stretch of clover and vineyard. Now 2 modern armies were about to do it again, under a sun that would climb to 40 degrees Celsius and beat down on men in heavy wool. Behind Bonneau loomed the impatience of Joffre, who wanted the flag raised and wanted it raised now. In front of him lay a near-empty province and the gnawing certainty that emptiness was the most dangerous thing of all. The advance was set. The hesitation was already poisoning it. At 5 in the morning on the 7th of August, the columns crossed the frontier, and the first blood of the French war was spilled at a small border town called Altkirch, 15 kilometers south of Mulhouse. Altkirch did not fall to a clever maneuver. It fell to cold steel. French infantry fixed bayonets and charged uphill into the town in exactly the way Plan 17 had promised they would, with raw aggression, straight at the enemy. They took it. The cost was 100 men killed. In the wars that were coming, 100 dead would be a rounding error, a footnote to a single morning's bombardment. But on this first day it felt like a victory worth a poem, the spirit of the attack vindicated in a single rush. Then Bonneau stopped. Even with the town in his hands, he could not shake the feeling that he was being lured. He paused, he scouted, he waited while messages from above crackled with one demand: keep going, reach the Rhine. Reluctantly, on the 8th of August, he pushed forward again, and Mulhouse simply opened its gates. The German garrison, the 58th Brigade, had pulled out rather than be trapped in a city it could not hold. French soldiers walked into Mulhouse almost unopposed, and the city erupted. After 44 years under the German eagle, the people of Mulhouse poured into the streets. Flowers rained down. Strangers wept and embraced soldiers they had never met. To these Alsatians, the men in French blue were not an army. They were the return of something stolen from their parents. In Paris, the news landed like a thunderclap of joy. The veiled statue, the black-shaded maps, the 44 years of mourning, all of it seemed to be ending in a single triumphant morning. General Joffre issued a proclamation that was read aloud across the nation, addressed to the children of Alsace. After 44 years of sorrowful waiting, he declared, French soldiers once more tread the soil of their noble country, the pioneers of the great work of revenge. Long live Alsace, the proclamation ended. Long live France. It was a beautiful moment. It was also a trap snapping shut, because while the people of Mulhouse threw flowers, a German soldier turned commander of the 7th Army, Josias von Heeringen, was tearing up his own plans in a fury and turning his entire army around. The fall of Mulhouse was not just a military problem for the Germans. It was an insult delivered to the new empire on German soil. Heeringen would not let it stand. He did something drastic. He overthrew his deployment plan, the careful timetable of mobilization, and ordered forces that were supposed to be assembling for other tasks to wheel south and crush the French intrusion at once. He summoned 2 corps, the 15th Corps under General Berthold von Deimling at Strasbourg, and the 14th Corps under General Ernst von Heuningen-Huin near the Rhine. The 14th Reserve Corps of General Richard von Schubert would keep mobilizing along the Rhine bridges. And to be certain of the result, Heeringen secured the temporary loan of an entire additional formation, the Bavarian 1st Army Corps of General Oskar von Zylander. His plan was simple and merciless: turn the French left flank and shove Bonneau's whole corps backward against the Swiss border, where it would have nowhere left to run. Now picture what those German soldiers actually did to get there. The men of Huyningen-Huen's corps were so close to Mulhouse that they did not even bother with the railways. They marched, on foot. For 40 hours straight, 58 battalions of them poured across the Rhine Valley over fields of grain and clover, past vineyards and orchards, through hawthorn hedges under a blazing sun that touched 40 degrees Celsius. Men dropped from heat. The columns staggered on anyway. This was the German answer to French élan. Not a poem, but a brutal, sweating, relentless march to put a wall of gray infantry exactly where the French did not expect one. While Bonneau's men were still being hugged in the streets of Mulhouse, tens of thousands of German troops were closing in from the north and east, exhausted, furious, and far more numerous than anyone in the French command had imagined. The flowers were not yet wilted. The counterblow was already on its way. In the early morning of the 9th of August, the calm shattered. Parts of the 14th and 15th Corps, fresh off their punishing marches from Strasbourg and the Rhine, slammed into the French at Cernay, just northwest of Mulhouse. This was the moment Plan 17 met reality, and reality was wearing field gray and carrying machine guns. Watch it unfold. The German infantry comes out of the Hart Forest in the gray light, emerging from the tree line in numbers that make French outposts blink and look again. There is no romance here, no bayonet poem. There is the flat, tearing sound of machine guns and the crash of field artillery walking shells across open ground. The French, spread thin in and around a city they had occupied without a fight, suddenly find the open doorway behind them, filling with armed men. Bonneau's nightmare, the trap he had smelled for 2 days, is closing exactly where he feared it would. French command begins to break down. Units that should be acting together instead fight on their own, isolated, each pocket of soldiers swinging blind in the smoke. Orders arrive late or not at all. The German plan is working. Heeringen wants to hook around the French left and pin them against the Swiss frontier, and his corps press forward to do precisely that. For the French infantry on the ground, the war stops being a parade and becomes a series of desperate, disconnected stands, small groups holding a road, a wall, a railway embankment, while the gray tide laps around their flanks. Joffre, hundreds of kilometers away, feels the ground shifting and reacts. He hastily flings a reserve division toward the fight, hoping to stiffen the defense and save the prize. But distance is its own enemy. The reinforcements are too far, the roads too clogged, the timing too cruel. They will not arrive in time to matter. The first lesson of the war is being written in front of Bonneau. In 1914, ground taken in a day can be lost in an hour, and a flag raised in triumph can be hauled down before the ink on the newspaper headlines has dried. By the 9th, Bonneau is already doing the thing every instinct in his cautious body had warned him about. He begins to pull back. He had never believed in this advance, and now the advance is devouring itself. Slowly, methodically, fighting as he goes, he starts to withdraw his men from a city that had wept with joy to see them only the day before. On the 10th of August, it is over. German troops storm back into Mulhouse and retake it. The tricolor comes down. The crowds that had thrown flowers now watch in horror, because they understand what is coming. Those Alsatian civilians who had cheered the French, who had wept and embraced strangers in blue, are now left exposed to German reprisals for the crime of celebrating too soon. Their joy has marked them. The army that promised liberation is marching away west, and the occupier is marching back in, and the people in the middle will pay a price that no proclamation can shield them from. Bonneau pulls his corps back toward the fortress of Belfort, the very base he had set out from, to escape encirclement against the Swiss border. The grand opening move of the French war has folded in on itself in 72 hours. The city captured, the city celebrated, the city lost. A complete circle of triumph and disaster, drawn in 3 days and 100-odd dead. And then comes the reckoning of command. Joffre, the calm man at the top, is not calm about this. To him, the retreat is more than a tactical setback. It is a humiliation broadcast to the whole nation, the first headline of the war turning from glory to retreat overnight. He does not blame the plan. He does not blame the orders that pushed a reluctant general forward. He blames the general, charging Bonneau with a lack of aggression with failing to show the very spirit of the attack that Plan 17 worshipped. Joffre relieves him of command on the spot. The commander of the 8th Cavalry Division, General Louis Aubier, is sacked alongside him. In the span of a single week, the opening battle of the war has consumed 2 French generals. But Joffre is not finished, and neither is France. The loss of Mulhouse is too public, too painful, to leave as the war's first chapter. So Joffre reaches for more. He pours 4 additional divisions into the south and rebadges the force with a grander, prouder name, the Army of Alsace. And to command it, he recalls a one-armed veteran general, Paul Pau, a soldier hard enough to do what Bonneau would not. On the 14th of August, barely 4 days after the first defeat, the second French invasion of Alsace begins. This time it grinds forward with more weight and more care. Pau's troops push out from Belfort against German landwehr brigades fighting delaying actions across the valleys. On the evening of the 14th, French soldiers take the town of Thann. By the 16th, the leading units reach the western outskirts of Mulhouse once again. The Germans, their 14th and 15th Corps now exhausted and disorganized from their earlier forced marches and increasingly needed elsewhere, give ground. On the 18th and 19th of August, the French fight their way back into Mulhouse a second time. In the wealthy suburb of Dornac, the artillery of Colonel Robert Nivelle, a name that would echo far louder later in the war, proves decisive, blasting the German troops back. By the evening of the 19th, the city is French again. The Germans are pursued eastward toward the Rhine, leaving behind 24 guns, 3,000 prisoners, and heaps of equipment. For one more brief moment, France holds Upper Alsace. The dream is alive a second time. And then, once more, the wider war reaches down and snatches it away. Step back from the maps for a moment and stand among the men who actually did this. They marched into Alsace believing in something almost holy, that their courage, their willingness to charge, would be enough. At Altkirch they proved they could do it, surging uphill with bayonets fixed, and 100 of them never came back down. Multiply that small, almost quaint figure across what was happening in the same days a little to the north, and the true face of this war comes into focus. In the larger Battle of the Frontiers, of which Mulhouse was only the opening note, French soldiers were dying in numbers no nation had ever absorbed. On a single day that same August, more than 27,000 French soldiers were killed, the bloodiest day in the entire history of the French army, before or since. 27,000 men in 24 hours. The spirit of the attack was being fed into machine guns. The men of Mulhouse learned, faster than anyone wanted them to, what modern firepower did to flesh and courage. They had been sent forward with too few maps, too little intelligence, and a doctrine that prized the bayonet over the spade. They were led, too often, by elderly commanders schooled in an older war, and they were short of the junior officers who actually held companies together under fire. When the German machine guns opened up out of the hard forest, the difference between a beautiful idea and a survivable one became horribly clear. And then there were the others, the ones who never carried a rifle. The people of Mulhouse, who had done nothing but believe. They had thrown the flowers. They had wept and cheered and welcomed the soldiers as the end of a 44-year sentence. When the French withdrew, those tears became evidence. Civilians who had celebrated were left to face the returning occupier, accused, punished, made to answer for a single day of hope. That is the cruelest arithmetic of this whole episode. The soldiers could retreat to Belfort, but the people who greeted them could not retreat anywhere. They were home, and home was about to be punished for cheering. The end of the story is not a battle. It is an order to leave. After the second capture, Joffre wanted the offensive to roll on. But news was arriving from the north, and it was catastrophic. The main French armies were being shattered in Lorraine and the Ardennes. The great German scythe was swinging through Belgium and down into France, and every man became precious somewhere closer to Paris. Upper Alsace, won twice at real cost, was suddenly a luxury France could not afford. On the 26th of August, the order came down. The French withdrew from Mulhouse for the final time, pulling back to a more defensible line near Altkirch. The army of Alsace, the proud name Joffre had conjured to erase Bonneau's failure, was dissolved on the very same day. Its divisions were broken up and scattered to the armies fighting for survival closer to the capital. The 7th Corps was sent north toward Picardy. The 8th Cavalry Division went to reinforce the 1st Army. The German 7th Army, its job in the south essentially done, would soon be pulled away as well, rolling north toward the River Aisne and the trench war that was coming. And so the city that had been French, then German, then French again, became German one last time and stayed that way. Mulhouse would not return to France until the armistice that ended the entire war, 4 years later. Everything paid for it, the 100 dead at Altkirch, the broken command, the punished civilians, the 3,000 prisoners taken and the men lost taking them, bought a city that France then chose to abandon. The opening offensive of the French war ended not with a flag planted in triumph, but with a column of tired soldiers marching west, away from the province they had come to liberate. So, what did it all change? On the surface, almost nothing. The lines ended roughly where they had begun, with a thin sliver of German territory held near Belfort and the great prize abandoned. But beneath the surface, Mulhouse changed the way France understood the entire war. It was the first place the French army discovered, in blood, that Plan 17 was a fantasy. The doctrine of pure aggression, of élan over firepower, met German machine guns and railways, and disciplined mass and recoiled. The lesson learned at Mulhouse and across the Battle of the Frontiers was the lesson that would govern the next 4 years, that courage alone could not cross open ground, swept by modern weapons, and that the spade and the gun mattered more than the bayonet and the song. There is a colder reading, too, offered by historians long afterward, that Mulhouse was a battle fought in the wrong place, for the wrong reason. The right place to decide the war was far to the north. The reason France lunged east was not strategy but prestige, the ache of 1870, the need to feel the old wound close. Joffre wanted German forces pinned in the south, and in a strange way he got that the German 14th and 15th Corps were dragged out of position and exhausted chasing the French around Alsace, and they arrived late and worn out to the battles that actually mattered. Both sides had tried to use this corner as a magnet. Both partly succeeded, and the fog of war swallowed the rest. What Mulhouse truly changed was the mood of a nation. The war began for France not with the disaster it would soon become, but with a single intoxicating morning of flowers and weeping and a city reclaimed, followed immediately by the cold water of how this war would really be fought. Where does Mulhouse rank among the battles of the First World War? Honestly, in raw scale, it does not. Beside Verdun, where men died for 10 months in a moonscape of mud and shell fire, Mulhouse is a skirmish. Beside the Somme, where 20,000 British soldiers fell on a single morning, the 100 dead at Altkirch barely register. Beside the Marne, the battle a few weeks later that actually saved Paris and turned back the German tide, Mulhouse decided nothing. But importance is not only measured in the size of the graveyard. Mulhouse holds a place that none of those greater battles can take from it, because it was first. It was the opening French shot of the entire war, the very first time French soldiers stepped onto enemy ground in 1914. And it was the first place the grand French theory of victory was tested and found wanting. Every catastrophe that followed in those opening weeks, every shattered attack across the frontiers, the 27,000 dead in a single day, all of it was foreshadowed in those 72 hours around one Alsatian city. So here is the verdict. As a feat of arms, Mulhouse was small and confused and ultimately futile, a city taken and lost and taken and abandoned. But as a turning point in the mind, it was enormous. It was the moment France's beautiful, doomed idea of war collided with the machine age and lost. It deserves its place not at the top of the list of decisive battles, but at the very front of the story, as the prologue that warned everyone what was coming, in a language nobody yet knew how to read. A city won with flowers and lost with reprisals, fought over for pride and surrendered for survival. Mulhouse was the war's first promise broken and the first lesson written in blood. If this story gripped you, stay with us because just to the north, In the same terrible August, the French and German armies were colliding on a scale this little battle could only hint at. Next time we march into the inferno of the Battle of the Frontiers, where 27,000 men fell in a single day. You will not believe how close France came to losing the war in its first 3 weeks.